your affirmation before the sermon. Being prone to want to please people, I think, how can I change the sermon quick? Today I'd like to share a bit about the heart of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. And sometimes that's hard to grasp because we come from so many different places in our lives and so many different communities we represent, and often the story of Unitarian Universalism is not fixed within us. For example, in a Christian tradition, if you walked into a Baptist church, you would know the thickness of that story by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, and you're saved, and you come to that community, and that's what that community is about, and trying to reflect one's life on the life of Jesus, and you move back and forth, and you know that story. If you walk into a Buddhist temple, you might have some sense of Buddha Siddhartha moving from being the son of the king and being trained to be king and deciding that that's really not going to help a person's inner world. So Siddhartha leaves and moves in and has the experience of life and becomes the Buddha. And that's the Buddha, and that's the thickness of that story. And when a religious tradition has a story, for the most part, that has a founder and a history, and what people do is they move their own lives back and forth in relationship to that history into the here and now to determine whether they're being faithful to that tradition. So in a way, as much as it is a comparison of one's here and now life to the history, it's also a relationship to a set of, not in a negative way, but in a negative way, I guess, a static belief system. This is what that story is. It doesn't change. It stays throughout time, and that's the way it is from generation to generation to generation. And it's quite comforting in many ways. There's a security in that, because it gives the person a place of belonging. It allows one to have a stated identity. And if we have a place of belonging and we have a clear, solid identity, we have a place in this world and we feel good about it, and that's the way it is. And then I live out of that identity. As a matter of fact, in our culture, we kind of laugh at the middle-aged man in small red convertible, balding hair, driving down the road having a midlife crisis. And when we say that, you have a midlife crisis, you have an identity crisis. And when you have an identity crisis, that means your previous life and the values and the belief system that you have previously used to define who you are going to be in this world have cracked open, and you're really kind of lost and you don't know who you are and what's going on. And so it's an identity crisis, and we go crazy sometimes. So that's how faith traditions generally work. And we build that faith tradition, those belief systems, and it becomes our sense of culture. And when we look at it in terms of a sense of culture and belief systems, here's some quotes about culture and things and how that works. One by Tom Hartman. You may know Tom Hartman for Unequal Power. Kind of a liberal fella out of Vermont who has his radio show, probably the most popular liberal radio show in the country. In writing in Unequal Protection, talking about the relationship to rights of persons and rights of corporations, in his introduction he writes, "A culture is a collection of shared beliefs about how things are. Those beliefs are associated with myths and histories that form a self, a reinforcing loop, and a collection of those beliefs and histories from the stories that define a culture. Usually, these beliefs, like the air we breathe, the stories are rarely questioned." Which is really kind of nice, because if you question your story, you question, usually provokes anxiety. I don't know if you've ever been in counseling or kind of thing. When you start reflecting on your history, you start looking Anxiety gets provoked. A couple of therapists, Michael White and David Epstein, they have it like this in terms of meaning and story. Meaning is derived through the structuring of experiences into stories, and that the performance of those stories is constituted of lives and relationships. So we've internalized these stories from history, and then we perform those stories in the here and now. It's really quite capturing when you think about it. In the past 10 years, have your overall belief systems changed? The past 30 years, have they changed? Here's the problem. A culture is defined by a reinforcing set of stories and myths that move through time over and over again for 2,000 years, for 4,000 years. And they're there, and we can read some books that are 2,000 years old, and we look at today and we think we're in today. It's the same. Here's the problem with being Unitarian Universalist. And this is absolutely fundamental for being a Unitarian Universalist, which creates a crisis. From the works of William Ellery Channing. How many of you know William Ellery Channing? William Ellery Channing is one of the founders of Unitarianism in this nation. To Unitarian Universalism, William Ellery Channing is like St. Paul to the Christian church. Upon argument, I might have to take that back, but I'm not sure. But I would argue, but I could be wrong about that, but it's close. It's close. He is foundational to Unitarian Universalism in this nation. And he was writing around the 1810, 1820, 1830s. And in one, it really wasn't a sermon, he was addressing the Massachusetts State Legislature. And he says, and at that particular time, there was, through Calvinists and other religious traditions, there was a heavy-handedness on being negative about human nature. Original sin, humans are bad, need to be saved, need to go to heaven, but human nature was bad in the religious tradition. So he's saying, no, not so. As a matter of fact, the human nature is something to be esteemed, and the human nature has two powers that we need to honor and pay attention to. And the two powers of the human nature, two powers of the human soul, as he puts it, which make self-culture knows difference. Not the external culture, in which you internalize the beliefs from the external culture, bring them into yourself, decide what your identity is going to be, and gain your sense of belonging from that, and then moving out into life, which makes self-culture possible. The self-searching, we can search ourselves, and the self-forming power, we can form ourselves. We have the faculty of turning our mind toward itself, of recalling the past and watching its present operations. So here's Channing, I think this is 1828. He's saying that we can go inside of our mind, look at our past, understand our past, and see in the present operations of our past. Now that was urban psychoanalysis right there. Right? Because that's how it works, isn't it? That's exactly how it works. And here he is writing this before Freud, before Jung, before all these people. And then we have the capacity to form ourselves, and so then we participate in the decision-making process for our own personal transformation. Channing is saying that we have this capacity of self-transformation, and our natural spirit is in tension with culture. Because culture usually runs on a tradition, and he's saying, no, you internalize this, and you work, and you form yourself, and you move out. So here we are, as Unitarian Universalists, We're not looking at a history to compare ourselves to evaluate ourselves. That's not Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism is letting go in the past and forming your own self. Practicing psychotherapy for over 20 years now, one of the more difficult transitions for me and others that I've discovered is that when it comes time for a person to structure their own life, great anxiety comes up. And we look for structures externally that we can fold into so that we don't have to structure our own personal lives. For example, a quick example, say if you've gotten the peacekeeper role in a family situation. You're born the middle child, and there's arguments in your family, and you get the peacekeeper role. So wherever you go, when you leave the family, you're the peacekeeper. You become the counselor. You become the minister. You're the one who's going to reconcile the world with God. Talk about a big responsibility. You're the peacekeeper. So if you recognize that, when you decide not to be the peacemaker, who are you? Who are you to become? In graduate school, one of the biggest crises we witnessed in people going through graduate school was about halfway through, because in our program, in order to be in our program, more than likely you were also in therapy because of the counseling program. So you had to do your own therapy in the counseling program. And in that counseling process, many people discovered that they were in a doctoral program because that's what their father wanted them to do, not what they wanted to do. It was an identity crisis, because here's somebody who's lived all their life. They've gone to 4-year school, they've gone to a master's degree, now they're in a doctorate program, and they're going, it wasn't about me at all. And so they go into identity crisis, and they end up leaving the program and doing whatever. We don't hear from them after that. Hey, here's another one that, well, you know what happens. They go out and become a forest ranger. And listen to what Henry David Thoreau, another founder of Unitarian Universalism, and this is who we are. These are our founders. I do not wish to live what is not life. Living is so dear. If I stayed in that peacekeeper role, and that was my role, and I rigidly held on to that role, is that living life? When I grew up and I put this script on as peacekeeper and I live out of that role all my life, have I lived? I think that's what Henry David Thoreau is talking about. I get to my deathbed and I'll say, no, I lived the script that was given to me and I never really breathed freely. So the Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a history that we go back on and say, yes, these are absolutely true, and I can bounce my life on and off of them. When we go back into the Universalist history, the founders of Universalism, Unitarian Universalism, say, let go of the history and form yourself. Oh my God. What am I to do with that? That's anxiety filling, because mostly, I think, we kind of live in a trance in this culture. Do you remember the first time you came to the recognition that, oh, this country might not be as great as I thought it was? Do you remember that day? Or, oh, my family may not be the ideal family that I thought it was. Those kind of realizations. Well, being a Unitarian Universalist, we are called to have those kind of realizations as we go through life. Because you let go of the history. When you let go of the history, we don't necessarily have a structure that we fold into. We have to form our own. Further, Channing says on a theological basis, all these are theology, he says that, yes, we have to live in this life, finite. Yes, we have to work, we have to labor, we have to participate in this life. And he says the danger is to get, that's all that happens to us spiritually as we look to do good in this life. He says yes to that. But he says also, the divine is infinite. And there are times in life when we have to go out and experience that sense of the infinite. And that is where we can let go of culture, because when we experience that sense of the infinite, we become free. It has been my experience, some of the difficulty is, if we have that kind of meditative, prayerful process where we become one with the infinite, we really have that, sooner or later, we've got to turn around and step back into the finite. And Channing criticizes the religions of the day. He's saying, what's happened to religion of the day, you have a disregard for human nature and a negative aspect on human nature, and you have this extremely positive view on the infinite, and you live with this positive view on the infinite, and you don't take any of this experience because that's high human understanding, I guess, is one way to say it. It's affirmation of what the human nature is, that we have the capacity to go from here to experience the infinite and to be one with God, in a sense, one with the divine, which the Gospel of John does teach, be one with the Father, divine, one with the Father. But nonetheless, it certainly is there, that you don't move and integrate this experience of the infinite and oneness with the divine with the finitude, with the finite, with the daily work. The religions of his day were keeping those separate. And he said, no, you have this experience, you have to step back into here, and you bring this experience back into here. And when you do that, when you form social institutions, when you do that, you have this experience, generally of love and compassion in my experience, and you form these social institutions. The purpose, according to Channing, our founder, which makes our narrative thick when we begin to understand this, the purpose, when we come back, of social institutions is not for people to serve the social institutions, or not for social institutions to tell people who they are, but the purpose of social institutions is to facilitate the inward liberty of persons. That's the function of social institutions. He said if that's not the function of the institution, then you are living under tyranny. 1830. If that's not the function of social institutions, it necessarily means tyranny. Our family. That's what he is. What do we do with that? What do we do with that? Do we feel today our social institutions facilitate the inward liberty of what it means to be human? Do our present social institutions facilitate us, yes, to the finite, but facilitate us and welcome us to go and experience the oneness of the divine, and when we return, to influence the structure of the social institutions? According to Channing, social institutions are made for humans. Humans are not made for social institutions. Dangerous thing in Unitarian Universalist. It's not popular. We don't get police officers guiding and directing cars in and out of our parking lot. Generally. Because we would ask the law enforcement agencies not to use pepper spray. Unitarian Universalist. Sure. Especially when somebody's acting on their constitutional rights. You wouldn't do that. You all saw the pepper spray young people sitting across the sidewalk doing it. And the officer just went up and down, up and down, up and down. That's not a social institution. That officer represents social institutions. That's not a social institution helping the inward liberty of those people. That's what Channing is talking about. Furthermore, in Spiritual Freedom, a lot of people think that's a sermon. You ought to read that, because that's the Unitarian Universalist inward world. Channing's work on his nature of spiritual freedom. He's addressing the Massachusetts state legislature. He's addressing a political body. He's saying your responsibility is to help form a culture that helps us be free inside. And he actually affirms them for doing that. Because you have done this. if that's the case, or if that's the Unitarian Universalism you accept from Chan, if you accept that, then I want to define two spiritual aspects that we may have lost as Unitarian Universalism. The idea of praise. The last time you went to a Unitarian Universalist praise service. We haven't had one of those. Praise is not a word we use. And I think it is because praise has gotten that function definition of praise has an object to it. We're going to have a praise service to praise Jesus, to praise God, to praise this, or to praise that. Something external to who we are. When you do that, we go back to the definition of culture of the reinforcing loop that Tom Hartman was talking about, because praise, in a way, is letting go of all of what it means to be yourself and be in adoration or be in relationship with this object that you're saying is the highest value that exists in creation, in the universe. This is the highest value, and I'm going to praise this value system. I'm going to praise what that means. What that means is I let go of all of who I am. I experience whatever cognitive, conceptual process this object of praise has, and then when I come back and reform myself, I come back and I'm stronger with that conceptual process of that object. It's stronger inside of me. So I've got the reinforcing cultural loop that I have this object that I let go of all of who I am, go out and strengthen the conceptual process, because all objects that are human-oriented, God, they're all human. I mean, we make them up today because they're not here. So we make them up. So I reinforce that conceptual process, come back. I'm going to be fervent about defending that belief system. So I'm going to say for a Unitarian Universalist, praise is a good thing. But our praise, we can't have an object. It has to be there. There is no object to our praise. That sense of praise, of being and existing, and being free from our history, and breathing deeply in the presence of the river, of the ocean, of the tree, of one another, of where we exist, can also be an attitude of praise, but we don't go out and catch on to a belief system and bring it into us and make it stronger. Our praise is to let go of belief systems. Our praise is just to accept the experience of being and being there. That's the Unitarian Universalist sense of praise. I think these words were an experience of praise. And praise is funny from the Unitarian Universalist. I don't think we know we have the experience of praise until we're done. Usually people go into praise. I think it just happens. When was the last time, say, you were at the ocean and 15 minutes went by and you didn't even know 15 minutes went by because you were listening to the waves? When was the last time for 30 seconds you woke up in the morning and you heard a bird and it captured you? And you were kind of unconscious. Then when it was done, you'd say, isn't that pleasant? I can hear the birds this morning. I think that's the Unitarian Universalist praise. We are captured by the wonder of existence and the wonder of life. And we don't even know it till we're in it. These are some words of an experience of mine that were like that. In Vermont last year, a slight breeze moves dandelions. The air is full of seed. The earth is thick with water. The sound of it is everywhere. Springs and birthing streams come right from the dirt, following in a familiar path, gathers and sound begins. Praise. Another word that I think we Unitarian Universalists can come that moves our spirituality beyond language. And as you can see, I would say right through Channing, but this comes pre-Channing, so maybe Channing borrowed from the life and teachings of Jesus. When Jesus said, I have come to set the captives free, he wasn't referring to that they were caught in a landslide or an avalanche or something of nature that he had to go rescue them. The captives were captured by culture. St. Paul says, be not conformed to this world. We talked about last time I was here. Being conformed to this world is being captured by culture. We know that we are captured by culture. If we're born in this culture, we're captured by it because we've internalized it, so our spiritual work is to learn to let go of that. I've come to set the captives free, to release them from the culture that holds them. And that I have come to set the captives free is the heart of salvation. But how do we do that in ourselves, and how do we participate in that? And so I've made this definition of salvation that I think works for Unitarian Universalists. And how many of you, when you hear the word salvation, go, Right. We Unitarian Universalists have lost this language because it gets attached to belief systems that have become oppressive. Not only oppressive, but worked into our political process that structures some of our legislative stuff. It helps us all. Am I right? If you look back at any age that has tyranny, in any government kingdom that's tyrannical, you will find a fundamentalist religion attached to it. There's no atheist nation that was tyrannical that I've discovered in my reading of history. Have you? I have not. There's always a religion attached to tyranny that I've seen so far. I'm willing to be corrected on that. A definition of salvation that I think works with Channing and I also think works with the teachings of Jesus. Salvation is a thorough, critical self-reflection which results in the capacity of identification with all of creation and which develops the capacity of empathy that can be activated towards self and others including all aspects of the earth. Salvation is to be set free from the captivity of culture. And I'm saying today, we need to be saved. I don't know where you are with your understanding of what's going on in our political climate and the earth itself. But can you imagine, how many of you remember in the early 1960s, 63, 64, when we determined that the what's the thing that was making the ozone layer?
Fluorocarbons.
Fluorocarbons, right? Making holes in the ozone layer. How many of you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think if we'd have had this political climate, then we would have had trouble passing the legislation? Would the science then met with the resistance we have today? No. It could be over if we'd have had this political climate then. It's very scary to me that we have this political climate. It seems to me to be anti-science. Now, it's not the first time. Both Calvin and Luther were against science, preached against science. Nothing new. So what happens when we practice this Unitarian Universalist faith process that includes this sense of praise, that includes this sense of salvation? What happens when we say, okay, culture does hold us captive? It does. And I get free of that captivity. And then I ask, who am I going to become? But I also, if you've ever done this work in meditation and prayer, and you really get lost in the meditation or prayer, or you really get lost sitting at the ocean or sitting in a wood, or say you went to the woods where there's no electricity for 2 weeks or so, and you walk back into a Kmart or a Walmart and all the bright lights hit you, what the effect is? It's really kind of, you ever had that experience where it's just quiet and life is easy? And the next thing you know, you hear a loud blast of TV or something. It's just, our spirit doesn't like it. Okay? So we're captive, and then we are no longer captive. We are saved. Something. Rescued. No longer captive. Our eyes see the world differently. Now, I want to go run back in the bedroom, pull the covers up over my head when I see the world clearly. I don't know where you are with that. It's like, oh my God, what's happened? What do you mean corporations are protected by the Bill of Rights? What do you mean by that? See, I'm waking up, right? I don't know anything. I'm waking up. What do you mean that an act of commerce to be regulated by Congress is protected by the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights is to protect us from the federal government? So an act of commerce to incorporate is protected by the Bill of Rights. So what is to be regulated is now protected by the federal government, so it can't get regulated. That's insanity. Well, that's no longer democracy. That's no longer a self-determining people. It's something else. It's no longer what that document meant. I want to go in the bedroom, pull the covers up over my head. I'm like, what are they doing? Okay. I'm waking up. What do you mean that there are 400 dead zones on this planet? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by we have watched our economic and industrial process produce 400 dead zones over 45,000 square miles in which life can no longer exist? What is that? I'm waking up. Bruce Alexander has just written this book called The Globalization of Addiction Through the Free Market System. And oh my God, when we talk about the free market system, we're talking religion now. I understand that. Right? And he says that in the free market system, when it moves in, it dislocates people psychically and physically. And the dislocation psychically and physically, and it does, the free market system, you watch where it goes. People can't live their traditional life anymore because it doesn't produce money. They live on top of resources. Heaven forbid you live on top of resources. They come in, they move you off the land, you end up in poverty in the city. We can see that process going on right now. It's been going on for 100 years. Example after example after example we could give. It's just the truth. And when there is this psychic and physical dislocation, people cope with addiction. Addiction to TV, addiction to shopping, addiction to alcohol, addiction to drugs, whatever it is. But we are no longer living our truest selves, congruent with the tradition of history that we have been living with for hundreds and thousands of years. We are no longer the same kind of being that we once were. So we've got this, I'm waking up and I'm saying we've got this entity that's not a person, that has the rights of a person. I'm waking up and I'm watching the earth deteriorate so that wealth can move in a particular way. And I'm watching the human population, as these processes move through the earth, become addicted, and addiction becomes so normalized, we don't even question it anymore. We give drugs to it. This is the Unitarian Universalist faith, moving me to be aware of these issues. Yes, it is the Unitarian Universalist faith moving you to be aware of these issues. If we are going to follow Channing and Henry David Thoreau, we have those realizations, but we don't stop there. We do something about it. And there are things to do about it. There are movements to say corporations cannot have rights as people. There are movements that say, no, you can't destroy the earth for money. rights of nature. It's a beautiful, beautiful movement, rights of nature. There are movements saying this globalization of addiction has got to stop. And just as Channing said, the purpose of social institutions is to facilitate the freedom, the liberty within the person, which means a kindness within the social institution so that persons can be free. Bruce Alexander, the author of The Globalization of Addiction, says that social institutions must become more humane and consider the person's psyche as they're making legislative decisions. Not just the profit, but also consider the person's psyche as they're making legislative decisions. That's a great move. You don't take the money from the social safety net. You invest into it. That's what we did. That country thrived. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
We did. And we had wealthy people, and we had not wealthy people, but we had the country thrived. So, if we're going to practice Unitarian Universalism, when we read our founder and founders, we need to be involved in the structuring of society. It is not a religion where we step back and watch the world go by and say, ah, we're free. I'm being free of mine. I have a nice community. That's not what Channing calls us to do. He calls us to engage those social processes, those cultural processes that create social institutions, and says we must transform them as well as transform ourselves so that they are taking care of the people that are in the society with the social institution structure. Sometimes it might be nice to have a historical narrative that tells you everything's going to work out and there's going to be a new earth and a new planet. And you don't have to worry about that. Just bring people into the fold. And don't expand on that story that we have here. This story is all there is. It's absolute truth. It's reality. Stay with this story. Make sure your life's congruent with this story. That provides a great security. Over here you've got Unitarian Universalism that says, okay, we have a history, and we should use our history and understand our history. However, you're to be forming yourself. You're to be undergoing a self-transformation process all the time. Henry David Thoreau, I'm going to find out what is the kernel of life, and if it's meanness, then let's engage the meanness. Or if it's beauty and wonder, let's sit back and rest in the beauty and wonder. And I know that when you go to the ocean and hear the waves, you sit back in the beauty and the wonder. I know that when you sit down and close your eyes right now, you feel the breeze on your face, you experience the beauty and the wonder. I know in Vermont that's what I experienced. To practice Unitarian Universalism is our call.